Plan and implement security for storage. This module is designed to provide administrators with the knowledge and skills required to plan and implement comprehensive security measures for Azure storage resources, safeguarding data integrity, confidentiality, and availability. Learning objectives. By the end of this module, participants will be able to develop security strategies for Azure storage resources, ensuring data protection during rest and transit. Manage storage account access with effective access control and secure key lifecycle management. Tailor access methods for Azure files, blob storage, tables, and queues to specific use cases. Strengthen data security with soft delete, backups, versioning, immutable storage, BIOC, and double encryption. Prerequisites. None. This module is part of these learning. Introduction. Completed 100 XP. 3 minutes. This module is designed to provide administrators with the knowledge and skills required to plan and implement comprehensive security measures for Azure storage resources, safeguarding data integrity, confidentiality, and availability. Scenario. Imagine you are an Azure storage administrator responsible for managing storage resources in your organization's Azure environment. Your organization relies on Azure storage services for storing sensitive data, and you need to ensure that this data is protected against unauthorized access and data security threats. Learning objectives. By the end of this module, participants will be able to plan and implement security strategies for Azure storage resources to protect data at rest and in transit. Configure access control for storage accounts to manage permissions effectively. Manage the life cycle of storage account access keys to maintain security. Select and configure appropriate methods for access to Azure files, blob storage, tables, and queues based on specific use cases. Implement security measures such as soft delete, backups, versioning, and immutable storage to protect against data security threats. Configure bring your own key, BYOK, to enhance data encryption and key management. Enable double encryption at the Azure storage infrastructure level to provide an additional layer of security. Goals. The module aims to equip participants with the knowledge and expertise necessary to design, implement, and manage a comprehensive security strategy for Azure storage resources. Participants will be able to secure data at rest and in transit, manage access control effectively, and implement encryption and data protection measures to ensure the security of critical data assets. Next unit. Configure access control for storage accounts. Continue. Configure access control for storage accounts. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. Every request made against a secured resource in the blob, file, queue, or table service must be authorized. Authorization ensures that resources in your storage account are accessible only when you want them to be, and only to those users or applications to whom you grant access. The following table describes the options that Azure Storage offers for authorizing access to resources. Expand table. Azure Artifact Shared Key, Storage Account Key. Each authorization option is briefly described below. Microsoft Entra ID. Microsoft Entra is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service. Microsoft Entra ID integration is available for the blob, file, queue and table services. With Microsoft Entra ID, you can assign fine-grained access to users, groups, or applications via role-based access control, or BAC. Microsoft Entra Domain Services Authorization for Azure Files. Azure File supports identity-based authorization over Server Message Block, SMB, through Microsoft Entra Domain Services. You can use your BAC for fine-grained control over a client's access to Azure Files resources in a storage account. Microsoft Entra ID authorization for Azure Files. Azure Files supports identity-based authorization over SMB through Microsoft Entra ID. Your Microsoft Entra domain service can be hosted on on-premises machines or in Azure VMs. SMB access to files is supported using Microsoft Entra ID credentials from domain-joined machines, either on-premises or in Azure. You can use your BAC for share-level access control and new technology file system, NTFS, discretionary access control list, DACLs, for directory and file-level permission enforcement. Shared key. Shared key authorization relies on your account access keys and other parameters to produce an encrypted signature string that is passed on the request in the authorization header. Shared access signatures. Shared access signatures, SAS, delegate access to a particular resource in your account with specified permissions and over a specified time interval. Anonymous access to containers and blobs. You can optionally make blob resources public at the container or blob level. A public container or blob is accessible to any user for anonymous read access. Read requests to public containers and blobs do not require authorization. Authenticating and authorizing access to blob, file, queue and table data with Microsoft Entra ID provides superior security and ease of use over other authorization options. For example, by using Microsoft Entra ID, you avoid having to store your account access key with your code, as you do with shared key authorization. While you can continue to use shared key authorization with your blob and queue applications, Microsoft recommends moving to Microsoft Entra ID where possible. Similarly, you can continue to use shared access signatures, SAS, to grant fine-grained access to resources in your storage account, but Microsoft Entra ID offers similar capabilities without the need to manage SAS tokens or worry about revoking a compromised SAS. Next unit, manage life cycle for storage account access keys. Continue. Manage life cycle for storage account access keys. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. When you create a storage account, Azure generates two 512-bit storage account access keys for that account. These keys can be used to authorize access to data in your storage account via shared key authorization, or via SAS tokens that are signed with the shared key. Microsoft recommends that you use Azure Key Vault to manage your access keys, and that you regularly rotate and regenerate your keys. Using Azure Key Vault makes it easy to rotate your keys without interruption to your applications. You can also manually rotate your keys. Protect your access keys. Storage account access keys provide full access to the configuration of a storage account, as well as the data. Always be careful to protect your access keys. Use Azure Key Vault to manage and rotate your keys securely. Access to the shared key grants a user full access to a storage account's configuration and its data. Access to shared keys should be carefully limited and monitored. Use SAS tokens with limited scope of access in scenarios where Microsoft Entra ID-based authorization can't be used. Avoid hard-coding access keys or saving them anywhere in plain text that is accessible to others. Rotate your keys if you believe they might have been compromised. View account access keys. You can view and copy your account access keys with the Azure Portal, PowerShell, or Azure CLI. The Azure Portal also provides a connection string for your storage account that you can copy. To view and copy your storage account access keys or connection string from the Azure Portal. In the Azure Portal, go to your storage account. Under Security plus Networking, select Access Keys. Your account access keys appear, as well as the complete connection string for each key. Select Show Keys to show your access keys and connection strings and to enable buttons to copy the values. Under Key 1, find the key value. Select the Copy button to copy the account key. Alternately, you can copy the entire connection string. Under Key 1, find the connection string value. Select the Copy button to copy the connection string. You can use either of the two keys to access Azure Storage, but in general it's a good practice to use the first key, and reserve the use of the second key for when you are rotating keys. To view or read an account's access keys, the user must either be a service administrator, or must be assigned an Azure role that includes the Microsoft.storage/storage account/list keys/action. Some Azure built-in roles that include this action are the owner, contributor, and storage account key operator service roles. Use Azure Key Vault to manage your access keys. Microsoft recommends using Azure Key Vault to manage and rotate your access keys. Your application can securely access your keys in Key Vault, so that you can avoid storing them with your application code. Manually rotate access keys. Microsoft recommends that you rotate your access keys periodically to help keep your storage account secure. If possible, use Azure Key Vault to manage your access keys. If you are not using Key Vault, you will need to rotate your keys manually. 2 access keys are assigned so that you can rotate your keys. Having 2 keys ensures that your application maintains access to Azure Storage throughout the process. To rotate your storage account access keys in the Azure Portal, update the connection strings in your application code to reference the secondary access key for the storage account. Navigate to your storage account in the Azure Portal. Under Security plus Networking, select Access Keys. To regenerate the primary access key for your storage account, select the Regenerate button next to the primary access key. Update the connection strings in your code to reference the new primary access key. Regenerate the secondary access key in the same manner. To rotate an account's access keys, the user must either be a service administrator, or must be assigned an Azure role that includes the Microsoft.storage/storage account/regenerate key/action. Some Azure built-in roles that include this action are the owner, contributor, and storage account key operator service roles. Create a key expiration policy. A key expiration policy enables you to set a reminder for the rotation of the account access keys. The reminder is displayed if the specified interval has elapsed and the keys have not yet been rotated. After you create a key expiration policy, you can monitor your storage accounts for compliance to ensure that the account access keys are rotated regularly. To create a key expiration policy in the Azure portal. In the Azure portal, go to your storage account. Under Security plus Networking, select Access Keys. Your account access keys appear, as well as the complete connection string for each key. Select the Set Rotation Reminder button. If the Set Rotation Reminder button is grayed out, you will need to rotate each of your keys. Follow the steps described in Manually Rotate Access Keys to rotate the keys. In Set a Reminder to rotate access keys, select the Enable Key Rotation Reminders checkbox and set a frequency for the reminder. Select Save. Check for key expiration policy violations. You can monitor your storage accounts with Azure Policy to ensure that account access keys have been rotated within the recommended period. Azure Storage provides a built-in policy for ensuring that storage account access keys are not expired. Assign the built-in policy for a resource scope. Follow these steps to assign the built-in policy to the appropriate scope in the Azure portal. In the Azure portal, search for Policy to display the Azure Policy dashboard. In the Authoring section, select Assignments. Choose Assign Policy. On the Basics tab of the Assign Policy page, in the Scope section, specify the scope for the policy assignment. Select the More button to choose the subscription and optional resource group. For the Policy Definition field, select the More button, and enter storage account keys in the Search field. Select the policy definition named Storage Account Keys should not be expired. Select Review plus Create to assign the policy definition to the specified scope. Monitor compliance with the key expiration policy. To monitor your storage accounts for compliance with the key expiration policy, follow these steps. On the Azure Policy dashboard, locate the built-in policy definition for the scope that you specified in the policy assignment. You can search for storage account keys, should not be expired in the search box to filter for the built-in policy. Select the policy name with the desired scope. On the policy assignment page for the built-in policy, select View Compliance. Any storage accounts in the specified subscription and resource group that do not meet the policy requirements appear in the compliance report. To bring a storage account into compliance, rotate the account access keys. Next unit, select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure files. Continue. Select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure files. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. Note: Azure Storage supports using Microsoft Entra ID to authorize requests to blob data. With Microsoft Entra ID, you can use Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC, to grant permissions to a security principal, which may be a user, group, or application service principal. The security principal is authenticated by Microsoft Entra ID to return an OAuth 2.0 token. The token can then be used to authorize a request against the blob service. Authorization with Microsoft Entra ID provides superior security and ease of use over shared key authorization. Microsoft recommends using Microsoft Entra authorization with your blob applications when possible to assure access with minimum required privileges. Authorization with Microsoft Entra ID is available for all general-purpose and blob storage accounts in all public regions and national clouds. Only storage accounts created with the Azure Resource Manager deployment model support Microsoft Entra authorization. Blob storage additionally supports creating shared access signatures, SAS, that are signed with Microsoft Entra credentials. Overview of Microsoft Entra ID for blobs. When a security principal, a user, group, or application attempts to access a blob resource, the request must be authorized, unless it's a blob available for anonymous access. With Microsoft Entra ID, access to a resource is a two-step process. First, the security principal's identity is authenticated and an OAuth 2.0 token is returned. The authentication step requires that an application request an OAuth 2.0 access token at runtime. If an application is running from within an Azure entity such as an Azure VM, a virtual machine scale set, or an Azure Functions app, it can use a managed identity to access blob data. Next, the token is passed as part of a request to the blob service and used by the service to authorize access to the specified resource. The authorization step requires that one or more Azure RBAC roles be assigned to the security principal making the request. Use a Microsoft Entra account with Portal, PowerShell, or Azure CLI. Use Microsoft Entra ID to authorize access in application code. To authorize access to Azure Storage with Microsoft Entra ID, you can use one of the following client libraries to acquire an OAuth 2.0 token. The Azure Identity Client Library is recommended for most development scenarios. The Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL, may be suitable for certain advanced scenarios. Azure Identity Client Library. The Azure Identity Client Library simplifies the process of getting an OAuth 2.0 access token for authorization with Microsoft Entra ID via the Azure SDK. The latest versions of the Azure Storage Client libraries for .NET, Java, Python, JavaScript, and Go integrate with the Azure Identity libraries for each of those languages to provide a simple and secure means to acquire an access token for authorization of Azure storage requests. An advantage of the Azure Identity Client Library is that it enables you to use the same code to acquire the access token whether your application is running in the development environment or in Azure. The Azure Identity Client Library returns an access token for a security principal. When your code is running in Azure, the security principal may be a managed identity for Azure resources, a service principal, or a user or group. In the development environment, the client library provides an access token for either a user or a service principal for testing purposes. The access token returned by the Azure Identity Client Library is encapsulated in a token credential. You can then use the token credential to get a service client object to use in performing authorized operations against Azure storage. A simple way to get the access token and token credential is to use the default Azure credential class that is provided by the Azure Identity Client Library. Default Azure credential attempts to get the token credential by sequentially trying several different credential types. Default Azure credential works in both the development environment and in Azure. Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. While Microsoft recommends using the Azure Identity Client Library when possible, the MSAL library may be appropriate to use in certain advanced scenarios. For more information, see Learn about MSAL. When you use MSAL to acquire an OAuth token for access to Azure storage, you need to provide a Microsoft Entra Resource ID. The Microsoft Entra Resource ID indicates the audience for which a token that is issued can be used to provide access to an Azure resource. In the case of Azure Storage, the Resource ID may be specific to a single storage account, or it may apply to any storage account. When you provide a Resource ID that is specific to a single storage account and service, the Resource ID is used to acquire a token for authorizing requests to the specified account and service only. The following table lists the value to use for the Resource ID, based on the cloud you're working with. Replace account name with the name of your storage account. Expand table. Cloud Resource ID Azure Global Example. Account name.blob.core.windows.net Azure Government Example. Account name.blob.core.uscov.cloud.ap.net Azure China 21 ViaNet Example. Account name.blob.core.chinacloud.ap.cn. You can also provide a resource ID that applies to any storage account, as shown in the following table. This resource ID is the same for all public and sovereign clouds, and is used to acquire a token for authorizing requests to any storage account. Expand table. Cloud Resource ID Azure Global Azure Government Azure China 21 ViaNet Example. Storage.azure.com. Assign Azure roles for access rights. Microsoft Entra authorizes access rights to secured resources through Azure RBAC. Azure Storage defines a set of built-in RBAC roles that encompass common sets of permissions used to access blob data. You can also define custom roles for access to blob data. A Microsoft Entra security principal may be a user, a group, an application service principal, or a managed identity for Azure resources. The RBAC roles that are assigned to a security principal determine the permissions that the principal has for the specified resource. In some cases you may need to enable fine-grained access to blob resources or to simplify permissions when you have a large number of role assignments for a storage resource. You can use Azure Attribute-Based Access Control, Azure ABAC, to configure conditions on role assignments. You can use conditions with a custom role or select built-in roles. Note: when you create an Azure Storage account, you are not automatically assigned permissions to access data via Microsoft Entra ID. You must explicitly assign yourself an Azure role for access to blob storage. You can assign it at the level of your subscription, resource group, storage account, or container. Resource scope. Before you assign an Azure RBAC role to a security principal, determine the scope of access that the security principal should have. Best practices dictate that it's always best to grant only the narrowest possible scope. Azure RBAC roles defined at a broader scope are inherited by the resources beneath them. You can scope access to Azure Blob resources at the following levels, beginning with the narrowest scope, an individual container. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the blobs in the container, and to the container properties and metadata. The storage account. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all containers and their blobs. The resource group. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the containers and all of the storage accounts in the resource group. The subscription. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the containers and all of the storage accounts in all of the resource groups in the subscription. A management group. At this scope, a role assignment applies to all of the containers and all of the storage accounts in all of the resource groups and all of the subscriptions in the management group. Azure built-in roles for blobs. Azure RBAC provides several built-in roles for authorizing access to blob data using Microsoft Entra ID and OAuth. Some examples of roles that provide permissions to data resources in Azure Storage include Storage Blob Data Owner, used to set ownership and manage POSIX access control for Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. For more information, see access control in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Storage Blob Data Contributor, used to grant read/write/delete permissions to blob storage resources. Storage Blob Data Reader, used to grant read-only permissions to blob storage resources. Storage Blob Delegator, get a user delegation key to use to create a shared access signature that is signed with Microsoft Entra credentials for a container or blob. Only roles explicitly defined for data access permit a security principal to access blob data. Built-in roles such as owner, contributor, and storage account contributor permit a security principal to manage a storage account, but don't provide access to the blob data within that account via Microsoft Entra ID. However, if a role includes Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action, then a user to whom that role is assigned can access data in the storage account via shared key authorization with the account access keys. For more information, see Choose how to authorize access to blob data in the Azure portal. Access data with a Microsoft Entra account. Access to blob data via the Azure portal, PowerShell, or Azure CLI can be authorized either by using the user's Microsoft Entra account or by using the account access keys, shared key authorization. Caution: authorization with shared key is not recommended as it may be less secure. For optimal security, disable authorization via shared key for your storage account, as described in Prevent Shared Key Authorization for an Azure storage account. Use of access keys and connection strings should be limited to initial proof of concept apps or development prototypes that don't access production or sensitive data. Otherwise, the token-based authentication classes available in the Azure SDK should always be preferred when authenticating to Azure resources. Microsoft recommends that clients use either Microsoft Entra ID or a Shared Access Signature, SAS, to authorize access to data in Azure Storage. Data access from the Azure portal. The Azure portal can use either your Microsoft Entra account or the account access keys to access blob data in an Azure Storage account. Which authorization scheme the Azure portal uses depends on the Azure roles that are assigned to you. When you attempt to access blob data, the Azure portal first checks whether you've been assigned an Azure role with Microsoft.storage/storage-account/list-keys/action. If you've been assigned a role with this action, then the Azure portal uses the account key for accessing blob data via shared key authorization. If you haven't been assigned a role with this action, then the Azure portal attempts to access data using your Microsoft Entra account. To access blob data from the Azure portal using your Microsoft Entra account, you need permissions to access blob data, and you also need permissions to navigate through the storage account resources in the Azure portal. The built-in roles provided by Azure Storage grant access to blob resources, but they don't grant permissions to storage account resources. For this reason, access to the portal also requires the assignment of an Azure Resource Manager role such as the Reader role, scoped to the level of the storage account or higher. The Reader role grants the most restricted permissions, but another Azure Resource Manager role that grants access to storage account management resources is also acceptable. The Azure portal indicates which authorization scheme is in use when you navigate to a container. Next unit, select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure Blob Storage. Continue. Select and configure an appropriate method for access to Azure Blob Storage. Completed 100 XP. 7 minutes. When you access file data using the Azure portal, the portal makes requests to Azure files behind the scenes. These requests can be authorized using either your Microsoft Entra account or the storage account access key. The portal indicates which method you're using, and enables you to switch between the two if you have the appropriate permissions. You can also specify how to authorize an individual file share operation in the Azure portal. By default, the portal uses whichever method you're already using to authorize all file shares, but you have the option to change this setting for individual file shares. Permissions needed to access file data. Depending on how you want to authorize access to file data in the Azure portal, you'll need specific permissions. In most cases, these permissions are provided via Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Use your Microsoft Entra account. To access file data from the Azure portal using your Microsoft Entra account, both of the following statements must be true. You're assigned either a built-in or custom role that provides access to file data. You're assigned the Azure Resource Manager Reader role, at a minimum, scoped to the level of the storage account or higher. The Reader role grants the most restricted permissions, but another Azure Resource Manager role that grants access to storage account management resources is also acceptable. The Azure Resource Manager Reader role permits users to view storage account resources, but not modify them. It doesn't provide read permissions to data in Azure Storage, but only to account management resources. The reader role is necessary so that users can navigate to file shares in the Azure portal. There are 2 new built-in roles that have the required permissions to access file data with OAuth. Storage File Data Privileged Reader. Storage File Data Privileged Contributor. The Storage File Data Privileged Contributor role has permissions to read, write, delete, and modify ACLS